Brother Mark.
Not only were Rick and I in the same class, he's the reason I did graduate. He was smart and he wrote big, and that's all I needed. I just wish he'd have been a little bit smarter. I might have done better, but it's good to be here. Love the school, love this congregation. Just some of the best people in the world are right here, and I mean that. I just want everybody to know just how much I love this place, how much this school means to my family and me, what a vital part they have been to our life. Love this topic, love the whole theme of this lectureship, timeless truths, and never could it be truer than what we're going to talk about today. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. It's timeless. It's just 3 words in the Hebrew, but it says so much. We know it well. We all know this topic. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. You've probably heard it from the time you were a child. And we would expect Christians to know it, but non-Christians have even heard about this timeless truth. And not only that, people who don't even believe in the Bible have heard of this timeless truth most likely, and may even use it as a loose guide in their life. That's just the right thing to do. You treat others like you want to be treated. You love your neighbor as yourself. And it goes not only in the Old Testament where we first find it, but it carries itself all the way through the Old Testament and into the New Testament. And it's a thread all throughout the Old Testament, and is such a key part of the things that Jesus teaches, especially while he was here on the earth. We know it. We know it well. We know its meaning. However, I'm going to suggest that there's a lot of misunderstanding about this timeless truth. And we might wonder, how can that be when it's just so simple to understand? Well, we're going to look at that and study that together this afternoon. The depth and the width of this great command is astonishing. But what Jesus commands just prior to his death on the cross takes this to a whole new level. And that's where we'll end as we conclude this lesson today. I want to start by looking the rules-rich history. We're going to go all the way back to the first time in the Bible where we see that this command is given. The first time it was given is right in the center of the book of Leviticus. And Brother Kemp's lesson on Be Holy for I Am Holy just sets the stage for this in such a grand way. And you need to go back and listen to that sermon if you missed it. And it'll really help us to understand exactly what we're talking about today, because it's in this same context where Moses uses that same phrase, be holy for I am holy, but then he also uses the phrase that we're studying today. This command to love your neighbor as you love yourself, as I said, comes right from the center of the book of Leviticus. And it calls for not just empathy, but a radical empathy that people really hadn't considered much. At least they were living like they have never considered it much when it was first given. And to understand and to really grasp when this was given, let me just give the context of this. We don't have time to read it all, and you probably know it as well anyway. But the full context is they made their exodus from Egypt after those 400 years in Egyptian bondage. They made their exodus from Egypt. They were wandering in the wilderness. Then there were the instructions given concerning the priesthood. And then it culminates with the whole reason that God brought his people out of Egypt. And this is the part that I think Brother Kemp just laid the foundation for so well. Here's the purpose. Why did God do what he did? Why? Because he liked the Jews better than anybody else? No, this is why he did it. Leviticus 11, verse 45. For I am the Lord that bringeth you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore sanctify yourselves. And here it is. And you shall be holy, for I am holy. That's the reason. That's the purpose. He was going to separate unto himself a holy people. He repeats that same admonition 4 more times in the book of Leviticus, and it doesn't surprise us that in the very context that we find the topic of our lesson today, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Right there in that same context, we find that same admonition. Be holy, for I am holy. Speak unto all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say unto them, you shall be holy, for the Lord your God am holy. That's the context in which we find our admonition to love your neighbor as you love yourself. God brought his people, the children of Israel, out of bondage so that they could be a holy people. And don't miss this part, because this is where we're going to end. Look at the standard that he sets for these people. Be ye holy, as the Memphis School of Preaching is holy. That would be a big standard, wouldn't it? Be ye holy, like the elders in your local congregation are holy. That would be a great standard. That would be wonderful. But that's not the standard. Be ye holy. Why? For I am holy. That's what God says. There is the standard. And that's the context in which we find our command to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. That word holy, Strong's gives a good definition of it. To be sacred, to be morally set apart, or to be ceremonially sacred. And that's a good definition. But here's the problem. We have that command, be holy, for I am holy. But here's what I want to know. This is what I need to know. How do I become holy? I see the standard, be holy, for I am holy. Now what I need to know is, how do I get there? How do I get closer to that than I am right now? And that's an important question, isn't it? How can I get closer to God's holiness that I am right now? And this is what the book of Leviticus is all about. And that's our context. This is what it strives to answer. How does being holy, be holy, belong in a legal text so concerned with doing? Be holy. What's that doing in a legal context when it talks so much about doing? This is what Brother Wood said about that. And I love this quote. When Peter quotes the admonition to be holy as God is holy, the verb be is not the ordinary word for simple being. So when he says be holy, Brother Woods is suggesting that it's not the simple word, the verb to just be, as in being, but one which means literally to become holy. Now that makes me go, whoo. Become holy as I am holy. Same is true with the Old Testament command to be holy. Peter used it in 1 Peter, but it's the same with the command here in Leviticus chapter 19. The rules and regulations that we see in the book of Leviticus paints a picture of what holiness looks like. And it's in the details of the commands and the restrictions. God says, be holy. How? Here's how you do it. The restrictions, the commands to do things, this is what it looks like. Jack Cottrell says this, and I just want to focus in on one part of it especially. But he says, God gives us his law because he is a holy God who has an infinite zeal for right and wrong. We all agree with that. The commands of the law are for the most part the mirror of the transcript of his own holiness. Watch. They are God's holiness in verbalized imperative form. How can I become holy? God says, let me tell you how. Here are some do's, here are some do nots, and this will help you to become closer to what I am. And isn't that what the law is for? God's holiness was verbalized to the Israelites through the law of Moses. And of course, the biggest part that we know the best out of all of that law are the 10 Commandments. Watch this now. The first 4, God says, this is how you deal with me. If you want to be holy as I am holy, this is what you need to do as far as I'm concerned. And then the last 6, what does he do? He says, if you want to become holy as I am holy, this is how you deal with your fellow man. The first 4, how I deal with my God. The last 6, how I deal with my fellow man, which tells me something. How I treat my neighbor has as much to do with my holiness as how I treat my God. Now think about that. As we narrow the text in Leviticus 19, we'll get there right now. As it relates to how we deal with our neighbor. And I love this picture, especially being a farmer, a part-time, fly by the seat of your pants farmer that I am. I love this picture that he paints. And so narrowing the text in Leviticus 19 as it relates to how one deals with his neighbor, we begin to see a picture. And go ahead and turn to Leviticus 19. I'm going to have most of the passages up here behind me for time's sake. But we begin to see a picture of what this looks like, again, by thou shalt and thou shalt not commands in Leviticus chapter 19. If we want to see how we deal with our neighbor, we begin to see you know how when you take a Polaroid, some of you young people have no idea what a Polaroid is. It was the greatest invention when I was a kid. I thought it was everything. You can take a picture and you get it developed almost immediately. It comes out gray, and then you start to see color, and then you start to see a face, and then before you know, you got a full-blown picture. This is what it does as it begins to open up what this looks like as far as holiness with how we deal with our neighbor. This is the picture he begins. What does it look like? How do I treat my neighbor? What do you mean by that? Well, let me show you what he says here. And when you reap the harvest of your land, this is the context, Leviticus 19, 9 and 10, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of the field. Neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest, and thou shalt not glean thy vineyard. Neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and stranger. I am the Lord your God. So even when you're going out and making a living, you're gathering your crop, you should be thinking about other people. And when it comes to farming, which this was an agricultural economy at that time especially, this is what it looked like. As you gather your crop, don't be so greedy that you go out there and you get every last grain of corn or bean or whatever it is you're growing out of the fields. You leave the corners. And anything as you go and you take your sickle and you knock down the wheat and anything that fall out of the husk, don't pick that up and put it in the basket to harvest it. Just leave it there on the ground. Why? So the poor and the strangers can come in after you and get enough to survive on. And if you know anything about farming, you know that grain that falls on the ground doesn't last very long. It can last in the husk for a really long time. As a matter of fact, we've had soybeans that we didn't get out in the harvest, and the rain began to fall in the month of November, and we had to wait for the ground to freeze in late January before we could actually get out there and combine the soybean. So it can stay in the husk for quite a long time. But once it hits the ground, any rain that comes, it's going to ruin overnight. And so get this picture in your mind. You're out there in your field, you're gathering your harvest, and there on the side of the fields, look at them. You've got the poorest of the poor, you've got the widows, you've got the strangers, perhaps standing by the side of your field and waiting for you to get done so they can come in and gather enough for their families to survive on. God says, you think about other people. And what a picture that paints in our minds, doesn't it? Just as a side note, I noticed that even those that were on the welfare system, they had work to do. They had to go out there and gather it, didn't they? It's a wonderful concept, isn't it? You remember Ruth did this very thing for she and her mother-in-law. When their husbands all died and her mother-in-law's sons died, she was out there gathering grains. That's where she met her future husband too. Married a farmer. But that just paints a picture. Holiness, as far as God is concerned in dealing with our neighbor, is starting to think not so much of only myself, but other people, and thinking about their needs. And then we go on a little bit further. And if you read all of this in Leviticus 19, and you may have been doing that while I was giving that great illustration, the next commands, you just read through this quickly, regarding loving their neighbors, it's telling you don't steal from your neighbor. You don't deal falsely with your neighbor. You don't try to trick them. You don't try to steal from them. You don't try to one-up them. You don't try to say, well, here, I've got this cow to sell. Now, only you know in your mind that this cow is about half dead. But you tell your neighbor, boy, this is a great cow. It just birthed last year, and it's just the strongest cow I've ever had. Well, it's going to be dead within a week, and you know it. But you don't try to steal from your neighbor. You don't try to one-up him. You don't withhold money earned from a day laborer until the next day. You pay them at the end of the day. You treat them well. You pay them. You don't mistreat the blind. You don't mistreat the deaf. You be impartial when it comes to your judgment. Verse 15. Don't gossip or ruin the reputation of your neighbor. Verse 16. Don't keep hatred in your hearts towards your brother. All of this in Leviticus chapter 19. And finally, all of those do's and don'ts. Do leave some so they can gather after you. Don't lie. Don't mistreat. Don't tell falsities. Don't mistreat. Don't hate your brother in your heart. Finally, after all of that, we come to our text, Leviticus 19:18, where it just simply says, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. What does that mean? Well, he just painted a picture for us to see, didn't he? That's what it looks like. You think of others before you think of yourself. You treat them in the way that you would want to be treated. You think of their feelings. You think of their hearts. You think of their lives. You think of their livelihood. You think of their poverty. You think about other people, and that's what it looks like. It's simple to understand, and we know that. But then the second point, who is my neighbor? Oh boy, now this is where it gets interesting to me. Jesus really lays it out, and we'll get to that here in just a moment. But who is my neighbor? It wouldn't surprise us that most of the rabbinic translations and interpretations of Leviticus 19:18 identify their neighbors as a fellow Jew. Who is my neighbor? He's my fellow Jew. As do all the commandments in the Middle Ages. This is what they thought. Who's my neighbor? It's my fellow Jewish brethren. Some even went so far and suggested that it didn't even include all the Jews. I found this quote and I thought this was good. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself if he really is your neighbor, if he is good, but not if he's wicked. As it is written, to fear the Lord is to hate evil. So you can hate some people. Why? Because that just shows that you fear the Lord. And what happened then, aren't you glad it doesn't happen now where people focus on one verse and then ignore other verses? Aren't you glad that's not a problem anymore? He says sarcastically. We didn't invent that. That was being done before denominationalism was even a thing. They did it even all the way back in the Old Testament. They focused on one verse and the neglect of others. But here's the thing. If you're in Leviticus 19, look at verse 34. This should have removed all doubt when they asked this question, who is my neighbor? In the very same context. But the stranger, the non-Jew that dwelleth with you shall be unto you as one born among you, and thou shalt love him as thou love thyself. That should have removed all doubt. But what did they do? That doesn't belong in there. Let's focus on this one, where I can use some word wizardry and I can just love who I want to love and forget about everything else. That was their way to justify hating certain people while loving other people. And here's the thing, they felt just fine in their hatred of whomever they wanted to hate. And not only did they feel good about it, but they felt like that's what God would want me to do. Listen to this quote from Ben Sira. This is in the Apocrypha, but this just kind of tells you the mentality. He says, there be two manner of nations which my heart abhorreth. That's hate. And the third is no nation. They that sit upon the mountain of Samaria, and they that dwell among the Philistines, and that foolish people that dwell in Shechem. Hate, man, hate. Those Samaritans, they're not even a nation. We have nothing to do with them. And this is from a very religious man. A man who would say, I keep the law of Moses perfectly. Leviticus is so important to me. And then to write something like this. You read Josephus, read some of his feelings about the Samaritans. He hated them with a passion. The Jewish prayers, if you remember, some that have been discovered, thanked God that they didn't make me a woman, a slave, or a Gentile. That sounds like somebody who's believing and following, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Well, what did they do? The Jew, and only certain Jews, are my neighbors. I can hate everybody else as long as I love the people that I think fit into that characteristic. Brother Waycaster, in one of his commentaries, describes how that many of the Jews, and if you read there, you look at the route, you can almost just see it in your mind's eye as you read what he has there, how they would go around Samaria and re-enter Judah. Wouldn't even walk through Samaria. This is how they hated their neighbors who were related to them. Even the disciples, when Jesus had his face set to go towards Jerusalem, they went through Samaria. Jesus didn't go around. When they went through Samaria, you remember the Samaritans didn't accept him because he had his face set to go to Jerusalem. Remember what James and John said? Jesus, you just say the word, man, we'll call down fire from heaven right now. We'll just wipe them all out. And then you remember what Jesus said? That's not why we came here. We didn't come to destroy. That goes against everything. You know, one of those same apostles, just a few years later, he walked from Jerusalem down to Samaria, and he laid his hands on some of those Samaritans that had just been baptized and prayed with them so that they could receive the Holy Spirit. What changed? From someone who wanted to rain down fire and wipe out all the Samaritans in that village, and probably, if we're honest, he probably wouldn't have minded wiping out all the Samaritans together. What changed? Where a man could go from that attitude to traveling all the way down there for one purpose. I'm going to lay my hands on these people, not to hurt them this time, but to pray with them so that they can receive the power of the Holy Spirit. What changed? Jesus came into the world. And he taught. And he showed us what this command meant then, what it meant then. Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. Therefore, all things whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do you even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Now, I said all of that to keep in mind. I set all of that stage just to give us an idea of what the attitude was at that time. Oh, I'm a religious person. Well, don't you hate the Samaritans? Yeah, but that's not my brother. That's not my neighbor. Well, don't you hate a lot of the Jews? Yeah, but they're wicked. They're not my neighbor. Are you a good man? Oh, I'm a great man. Why? Because I love this little group of people right here. And then here comes Jesus in that atmosphere, and he says things like this. Then after affirming, in Mark chapter 12, verses 29 through 31, we won't read all of this. Here comes this scribe to Jesus and asks him, what's the greatest commandment? And this sounds familiar. The second is like unto it, namely this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There is none other greater commandment than these. He summed up the entire law of Moses with these two commands. You love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and you love your neighbor as yourself. That's been since the beginning of you as a people. You should know this. But we still want to know, what's the answer? Who is my neighbor? You know where I was going with this, didn't you? Luke chapter 10, because that very question is answered. And keep in mind the background that we just talked about. And Jesus answering said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves when he asked that question, who is my neighbor? Which stripped him. And you know what happened. Drop on down there. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was. Why do you think he chose Samaritan there? Certain Samaritan, As he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him. He went to him, he bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, took care of him. On the morrow, when he departed, he took out 2 pence and gave them to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him. Whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. And then he asked the question, Which now of these 3 thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell among thieves? This fellow that came and asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? After he gave that summation of the law, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, who is my neighbor? Jesus said, well, let me tell you a story. And then he tells this story. And then he asks this question. Who do you think was a neighbor unto him that fell among thieves? And watch what this guy's answer is. And he said, the Samaritan. Is that what he said? No. He that showed mercy on him. Couldn't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. Remember Arthur Fonzarelli? When he wouldn't be able to say he was wrong. This guy couldn't even get himself to say the word Samaritan. And so what does he say? The one that showed mercy on him. And then watch what Jesus says. Go and do thou likewise. You act like a Samaritan. This Samaritan in this story, you go and you act like him. That is your neighbor. You see, what we're doing is this. Who can I love? Who can I hate? Who can I feel justified and not getting along with? Where instead, the focus in this instance ought to be on myself. I'm the one who is a neighbor to other people. I'm the one that shows my love to other people. They may love me. They may hate me. They may show appreciation. They might not even say thank you, but that doesn't change what I become when I understand this concept. I am to be the neighbor to other people. And here's the implication of this. If the Samaritan is my neighbor, listen, if the Samaritan is my neighbor, then everybody is my neighbor. That's what that lawyer got that day. If the one that we could all agree we have the right to hate, if even that guy is my neighbor, then what's that mean? Everybody is my neighbor. And this question cannot be answered only verbally, but it must also be answered in action. Just look, and I just highlighted, look at the verbs. It's not just saying, boy, that Samaritan looked over there and said, oh man, I sure love that man. What did he do? Look at the action. He had compassion. He went. He bound up his wounds. He poured. He set him on his beast. He brought him to the inn. He took care of him. He gave them. He said, take care. I will repay. What does it look like to love my neighbor? It's not just standing up here and thinking, we need to love our neighbors more. It is putting into action what Jesus expects of his people. People ought to be able to do more than just hear us speak about it. They ought to be able to see us doing it. Jesus talked about this on other occasions as well. But let's quickly go to our third and final point. We've seen the context. We've seen who our neighbor is. It's everybody. What's it mean to love my neighbor? We've already introduced it partially, but let's go a little bit further with it. What's it mean to actually love my neighbor? And this is another great thing. You know, you don't need to study extra biblical history, but in order to understand the Bible, but just little nuggets like this just show us, man, when Jesus came and taught the things that he taught, it was more than just interesting words for us to look back on and study. Man, just the things that he said, oh, you want to know why he was so effective? You want to know why people hated him so much? You want to know why people wanted to argue with him so much? You get back in the first century and just see what the attitude and the atmosphere was. Heliel, and that's how I'm going to pronounce his name. I don't know if it's right or not, but let's just say that it is. Heliel, he was the elder. Heliel the elder. He was a Jewish sage. And he lived in the 1st century BC. So pay attention to that. Right before Jesus came, Hillel lived. And he was famous for his interpretation of this law to love one's neighbor. And the story is told about him. And this is told over and over and over again. This story here, it said it happened again that a Gentile came before Shammai. And he said to him, "Convert me on the condition that you teach me the entire Torah as I stand on one leg." He pushed him away with the builder's cubit in his hand. The Gentile came before Hillel, who converted him. Hillel, said to him, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow." This is the whole Torah. The rest is explanation. Go and learn. And all the Jews of that day, oh, what a wonderful, wonderful explanation of that command that God gave. There could be nobody ever better to explain it as well as you. But I want you to notice something that's big here. His interpretation is in the negative. And why is this so important? This guy, Hillel, you may or may not have ever heard of him, but the Babylonian Talmud and the Mishnah and the Talmud are based on his interpretations. So what Jews believe today, this guy is a big deal. And this is his interpretation of it. It's in the negative. In other words, do not do to your neighbor that which is hateful to you. Do you see that? Watch it again. He pushed him away with a cubit, and he said, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow." And when you do that, you fulfill the law, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Now think about this. I can think in my mind the 101 ways that I would like to see you suffer. Man, my wife's least favorite way, this is, I don't know why, but she has this fear of being run over feet first by a steamroller. And I've tried to tell her, listen, if you're that slow where you can't just roll out of the way, then... But anyway, I'm going to pay for that later. Now everybody knows. I could think of all the ways I could look at my enemies and think, boy, I would like for him to die that way. I'd like for him to suffer that way. I'd like for him or her to hurt that way. But as long as I don't do it, I'm still a great and godly man. And it was in that atmosphere where Jesus comes in and says things like, "You've heard it said by those of old, thou shalt not kill. But I say," who is angry with his brother without a cause, he who calls his brother a fool. In other words, what he's saying is, Hillel, you're dead wrong. Their understanding of the law was simply not to do something to one's enemy. A person could have just the worst attitude of wanting his enemy to suffer as long as he restrains himself from hurting him. Let me ask you something. Is that what true love is? Is that what true love is? Let me tell you something. That's a miserable, 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 miserable life. Because I've been there, and probably you have too. And it's a hard thing to fight, isn't it? To where you don't hold hate in your heart for somebody who's done you wrong or somebody you just don't like. Yeah, there's a lot of things that you would like to say, but I haven't said it. But what's that happen when you just harbor it in your heart? It makes for a miserable life, doesn't it? So Jesus is not trying to punish us. He's trying to give us peace. What does true love look like? Yeah, there are some restraints. It does not envy. It does not rejoice in iniquity. It does not fail. Does not behave rudely. Does not provoke easily. Does not think evil. Yeah, there are some restraints. But what else is there? Love is. It's long-suffering. Love is. It's kind. It rejoices in truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, it endures. What does loving my neighbor as myself look like? It's not just the restraint, but it's the things that I do, even for those who don't think like me, who don't act like me, and who don't even like me. Putting this command in action is not just withholding my wrath, but it's doing good to my neighbor. Does a man love his wife simply because he does not beat her? Is that what true love is? That's just so shallow, isn't it? But see, that's what people think. Love is showing your wife you love her by not telling illustrations about being run over by a steamroller. How do I know you love your wife? How do you treat her? How do I know I love my neighbor? How do I treat him? You see, we laugh at Heliel, and we look at those people. You know, how could you miss it? How could you hold up one verse and neglect the other? And this is where I'm going to step all over my own toes. If your toes are down there too, you're going to get stepped on as well. I'm afraid way too many in the church interpret it the same way Heliel did. We do. We talk a good game. I'm going to tell you something. Sometimes we see far too much hate from our own brethren. And that's bad. Sometimes we see far too much hate from myself. And I can't control what other people do, but I can control what I do. We've got to get past the idea that so many for centuries have believed is love is not telling you what I really want to say to you and not doing to you what I really want to do to you. Not being nice to your face, but man, just as soon as you leave, just wait till you hear the things I say about you. That's not obeying this commandment. And remember what we said at the very beginning. The first four have to do with how we treat God. You go against and break one of those first four commandments, you're going to be lost. If we were under the old commandments, the Old Testament, I understand that, but those still are timeless truths, even present till today. You break those truths, you're going to be lost. But you break any of those last six that have to do with how we treat with one another. Yes, I know we're in the New Testament age, but we're talking about timeless truths. I'll be just as lost as I would be if I spit in God's face. And I want to go to heaven, don't you? Let's close with this thought. If you thought that was challenging, just wait. Right before Jesus left, and this, again, Brother Kemp's, I know it's the third time I've talked about it, we've set the standard, and his lesson did such a good job in showing what it looks like to be holy as God is holy. Just before Jesus left the earth, watch what he says. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You shall seek me. And as I said unto the Jews, whither I go, you cannot come. So now I say to you, a new commandment I give to you. Here it is, that ye love one another, not as you love yourself, but that you love one another. How, Jesus? Tell me. As I have loved you. Ooh-wee. That is how I love my neighbor. Jesus' love for you is unchangeable, John 13:1. It's holy, John 15:9. It's sacrificial, John 15:13. It's inseparable, Romans 8:35-37. And it's compassionate, Mark 1:45. Just imagine if we have that same type of love for each other. What did Jesus say would happen when those disciples had that same type of love? He gives the answer right here in this same text. Watch it. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples. How? If you have this love one for another. This command, it'll change the world. It'll change the church. And it'll change me when I implement it. You love one another as I have loved you. And so we'll close with this very last thought. Aren't you glad that Jesus doesn't love you sometimes like you love your neighbor? I am so thankful that his love has not been as fickle as mine has been sometimes, and just so ready to give up on people as mine has been sometime. I'm so glad that this verse is in our Bibles. But God commendeth his love toward us. How? In that while we were yet sinners, when I was at my worst, Jesus died for me. That's love. And that's the love we're supposed to have. God bless us as we meet this challenge head on. And I know it's possible to do because I know people who are doing it. And they're the best people in the world. And you know some too, don't you? Don't you love to be around them? Aren't they the best? Nobody has anything bad to say about these people because how could you? They're just so loving and kind. And if they can do it, then I ought to be able to as well.
Thank you, brother. Great challenge for us. But we have great example